Okay, so welcome to the first conference featuring the winners of our Ludwig Prize, Ludwig Prize 2024. The Ludwig Prize is a Wagnerian research award organized by the Richard Wagner Society of Avellino, La Voce Wagneriana. So today we are happy, we are pleased to have with us the winner, the first place winner, Dagmar Thielen. Dagmar, thank you, first of all. And then Dagmar is a scholar from Belgium and was awarded the first prize of the Ludwig Prize for her beautiful, outstanding article. Echoes of Wagner is the name of your article, and even the name of the title of this talk: Echoes of Wagner: Diversity and Unity in Western European Wagnerism Around the 20th Century. So today, Dagmar will present her article, but before, I would like to invite our artistic director, the artistic director of the Richard Wagner Society of Avellino, Andrea Camparsi, to say a few words. So, Andrea, thank you, even to you, thank you for being here, and could you please introduce us, the winner of the Ludwig Prize? Can you please introduce Miss Dagmar Thielen? So,
thank you, Luca, and thank you, Dagmar. Congratulations. And so, congratulations. Yes. Dagmar Thielen is an art historian and doctoral researcher specializing in 19th century studies with a focus on Wagnerism, transhistorical motifs, and the Gesamtkunstwerk. Her research explores the intersection of art, architecture, and performance, emphasizing transhistorical aesthetics and the cultural impact of Wagner's ideas around 1900. Since October 2023, she has been pursuing a joint PhD at the Catholic University of Leuven and Coventry University with a research project titled Wagnerian Networks Beyond France: New Perspectives on Gender, Art, and Spaces of Performance Around 1900. Her work examines how Wagner's artistic and philosophical ideas influenced cultural networks, gender dynamics, and performative spaces.
Wow. Yeah. Congratulations, Dagmar.
Congratulations.
So, once again, congratulations. Once again, thank you for being here, Dagmar. And so please tell us about your research and about your project, your article, Echoes of Wagner. So please, thank you, Dagmar.
Okay. Okay, let's go ahead. I'll share the screen. Is it visible? Give me a thumbs up.
Yes. It's visible. Yes.
Perfect. So, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning. My name is Dagmar Thielen, as has been said. I am a PhD researcher studying Wagnerism at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. I'm honored to be the recipient of the very first Ludwig Prize for Wagnerian Research, awarded for my paper titled Echoes of Wagner: Diversity and Unity in Western European Wagnerism Around 1900. And thanks to La Voce Wagneriana and the online Richard Wagner Museum, I have the absolute pleasure of sharing that paper with you today. I'll begin with a brief introduction of myself, just to provide a bit of context as to how I got to researching Wagner in the first place. Then I'll place the paper's topic within a broader historical context before delving into the paper itself, where I'll expand on the original work and connect it to the larger themes of my ongoing research. We'll wrap up with a Q&A session, of course, and I'm genuinely looking forward to hearing any of your thoughts. Thank you so much for being here. So, as Andrea and Luca have said, I'm educated as an art historian. I graduated magna cum laude from the Catholic University of Leuven in 2021, specializing in 19th century and medieval art. My master thesis focused on the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck, which I analyzed through the lens of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art. I've always been fascinated by the idea that the Gesamtkunstwerk has its roots much earlier in Western art history than traditionally thought. This belief really took shape for me during my studies when I combined recent philosophical and architectural theories with the analysis of medieval altarpieces, especially the Ghent altarpiece, to argue that even though the concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk was only formally defined in the 19th century, its emotional and spiritual impact can be traced much further back. During my studies, I conducted research on the Ghent altarpiece at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Brussels. Outside of my academic work, I also published 2 monographs, one in Dutch and one in German and English, on my father's art. He's a contemporary artist. I created 2 exhibitions of his work as well, one in 2019 and one in 2024, both hosted by contemporary art museums in the Netherlands. I'd like to share these aspects of my work with you today, just to frame my view of art history, not as a strict timeline of separate periods, but as a living history of human emotion and memory, where ideas and feelings flow into each other across centuries, so that my treatment of Wagnerism in the paper I will present today will make a bit more sense. So the first exhibition I curated in 2019 presented my father's work in chronological order and served as a celebration of his career up to that point. Evert Thielen creates very large polyptychs and paintings, as well as smaller works, and I wanted to highlight that theatrical quality. To achieve this, we painted all the walls, floors, and ceilings black and collaborated with a stage technician specializing in light design. The exhibition was lit using stage lighting, and Wagner's Wezendoncklieder played in the background to heighten the dramatic atmosphere. Following the success of this first exhibition, which attracted nearly 150,000 visitors, I was invited to return and curate a second exhibition in 2024, for which I also wrote a 3rd monograph. This time, we approached the presentation differently. The polyptychs were displayed downstairs in the museum's grand hall, where their monumental scale and the dramatic lighting could be fully appreciated. Upstairs, in the museum's smaller rooms, we worked with color. I divided the entire body of work into emotional categories, grouping paintings that expressed similar emotions together, and assigned a color to each category. As visitors moved through the museum, they experienced these emotional cocoons, becoming fully immersed in each emotional space. Instrumental Wagner music played throughout the exhibition to further enhance the experience. In sharing this background, I hope to have given you some insight into my approach to curating, my understanding of art, and my deep appreciation for Richard Wagner. Now let us turn to the topic of my paper. So any research on Wagnerism should begin with at least a brief historical context in which Richard Wagner created his works and forged his aesthetic vision. Europe entered the 19th century as a continent on the brink of massive change, shaken by revolutions, political upheaval, and deep social unrest. New ideas like nationalism, socialism, and patriotism started to take hold, and people began seriously questioning not just their histories, but also their hopes and ideals for the future. Art began to change in terms of what it portrayed, who it spoke to, what it was meant to achieve, and even what it meant to be an artist. As the importance of the nobility and clerical powers slowly diminished, man himself increasingly came to stand in the spotlight. You could say that the cultural climate surrounding Richard Wagner had already been set in motion by earlier movements like Sturm und Drang, which was echoed and expanded by its broader pan-European sibling, Romanticism. Already in the late 18th century, Romantic art began moving away from traditional representation of religion, not rejecting the spiritual altogether, but reimagining it in a much more personal, internalized way. What we see emerging is an artistic search for transcendence that often took on a synesthetic qualities and was expressed through rich symbolic language that felt sacred, even if it wasn't tied to institutional faith. As the German art historian Hans Belting puts in his book The Invisible Masterpiece, it was in this open, free realm of ideas that man began to question himself more intensely, and that art moved into the space religion had left behind. A great first example of this is William Blake, who created his own all-encompassing mythopoetic universe, drawing on everything from Kabbalah to Christianity, classical mythology, and pagan imagery. Through this deeply personal mythology, he expressed his visions in a body of work that spanned poetry, painting, and illustration, all woven together by a kind of spiritual symbolism that set the tone for how Romanticism would link art with the sublime. In Germany, artists like Philipp Otto Runge built on this by abstracting medieval color, number, and nature symbolism into something more personal and mystical. His art was almost like a visual prayer, a small window into a spiritual world unique to him. One last example is Caspar David Friedrich, who uses medieval architectural and symbolic imagery to express a deep, emotional, and personal kind of spirituality. not something found in heaven, but something unfolding within ourselves. This romantic search for meaning, the way it blends the visual with the emotional and the sacred with the personal, really laid the groundwork for how Wagner would later approach art, not just as something to admire, but as a powerful way to communicate the transcendent and his vision of the future. The regenerative spirit of Romanticism, which took imagery and symbolic structures from the past and reworked them into a personal vision of the future, ended up becoming the blueprint for Wagner's creative process. With his all-encompassing Gesamtkunstwerk, Wagner brought together elements from classical drama, 18th century staging, romantic philosophy, pagan myth, and modernist art, and reimagined them in a way that felt both entirely new and strangely familiar. Wagner had not created something completely new, but rather reinterpreted the past and regenerated it by fusing together elements with an emotionally strong communicative force to create a deeply immersive, all-encompassing experience that had a transformative goal that alluded to the religious. In doing this, Wagner had provided an answer for the space left empty by religion, and had filled it in with art. Being very much a product of his time, Richard Wagner was a true child of the complex disciplinary fragmentation and simultaneous blurring of boundaries between artistic media that characterized the cultural climate of his age. He was either highly skilled, actively involved, or at least strongly opinionated on virtually every artistic discipline related to music, opera, and theatre in their broadest contexts. The range of interests and skills required for the material, theoretical, and spiritual forging of his all-encompassing work of art consequently links Wagner to every facet of late modern Western European cultural history. The diversity and totality present in Wagner's work attracted an equally diverse following, the number of which grew exponentially during the second half of the 19th century, peaking in the decade before the First World War, some 20 years after Wagner's death. Through his fusion of the arts and through the philosophical, musicological, and political depth of his writings, Wagner attached himself to a vast array of late Romantic and early modernist cultural, political, and social movements. As a result, he attracted followers across Europe, ranging from heads of state to occultists, early feminists, late Romantic poets, and avant-garde artists. The strong aesthetic diversity of Wagnerism, the artistic movement that grew from this immense influence, becomes immediately clear when looking at the examples on this slide. From the nationalist statues and festivals at the bottom to the mythical Gesamtkunstwerk envisioned as a space of artistic worship and meditation at the top right, to the geometric abstractions and the occult influences in the center and the theosophical art on the left. Each is deeply embedded in a range of modernist thoughts and ideologies. Despite their differences, all these Wagnerian interpretations share a common impulse, the search for an alternative. They were looking for a form of emotional piety, less vulnerable to the rapid transformations of early modernism, and more attuned to a new, deeply personal form of transcendence. While some followed Wagner out of fashion, for most Wagnerians, Wagner's work represented a catalyst, which helped them transcend their previous existence and inspired them to create new works of art that often bore little resemblance to Wagner's original intentions, but had everything to do with how his work personally affected them. Even during his lifetime, Wagner had actively encouraged others to treat his art as a starting point, as an aesthetic mirror. In a letter to his future father-in-law, Franz Liszt, he wrote, "Children, create anew." Like a lighthouse in the midst of a gathering storm, Wagner's total work of art illuminated the possibilities of what it could mean to be an artist in the dawn of a new age. For his followers, Wagner represented the fulfillment of a goal, and for his earliest admirers, he often embodied that goal himself. From his Bayreuth residence Wahnfried, built a stone's throw away from the Festspielhaus Opera Hall where his work was being performed, Wagner networked and promoted his work and himself to expand his influence all over Europe and North America. In his creation of both the artistic self as well as the total work of art, Wagner presented a cause for much of 19th and 20th century cultural Western Europe, as its artists, politicians, and thinkers saw their individual aims and theories reflected in the all-encompassing mirror Wagner held before them. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously captured this feeling by stating in the foreword of his anti-Wagner book Der Fall Wagner that Richard Wagner sums up modernity. It can't be helped. One must first become a Wagnerian. Flemish cultural historian Karel Wouters echoed this sentiment from a scholarly perspective in his 1983 doctoral dissertation, when he wrote that every scholar who concerns themselves with the art and cultural history of 19th century Western Europe will run into Richard Wagner at a certain point. As Wagnerism sowed its ideology in every field of Western European culture, it blossomed through the deeply personal interpretations of its followers. Because the diversity of the artistic and ideological expressions that adhere to Wagnerism, as well as the movement's seamless interwovenness with modernist culture, the study of Wagnerism presents a unique set of challenges. Because of its multifacetedness, Wagnerism is notoriously hard to define. In the 2020 book Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, author Alex Ross defines the composer's artistic legacy as a chaotic posthumous cult. When looking at artistic expressions of Wagnerism, the validity of Ross's view on the movement as chaotic and cult-like becomes clear. Mimetic Wagnerian art, like the examples on the top of the slide, which show direct references to Wagner's work, are just as much a part of Wagnerism as a sort of Wagnerism that holds more connection to the personal interpretations of the ideologies Wagner and his work either embodied or evoked than to Wagner directly, such as both examples shown below. Wagnerism's aesthetic chaos and the cult-like admiration of some of its artistic expressions have often led to the movement's treatment as a mere artist cult as part of late 19th century nationalism and historicism. This is also due to the very large scale of the research surrounding Richard Wagner himself, which attaches itself to a multitude of scholarly disciplines and which in part drives the research on Wagnerism to a cornered satellite position in relation to its famous instigator. In the study of Wagnerian art, scholarly disciplines have often classified it as a composer cult, framing it as a form of posthumous hero worship rather than a response to an aesthetic experience. This is why I introduced the preceding cultural and historical context of Wagnerism, to propose that Wagnerism is not solely a movement anchored in Wagner's person or works, but rather in the materialization of a widely shared cultural sentiment that permeated Western Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Wagner responded to this longing with his pioneering vision of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or the total work of art, yet the desire for such artistic totality precedes him. This research argues that the impact of Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk as a fulfillment of this longing was both collectively resonant and intimately transformative. Consequently, the artistic expressions it inspired could only be radically diverse. Such multifacetedness should not be seen as chaotic, but rather as indicative of a deeper unity. Each Wagnerian artwork seeks to articulate how its creator was personally affected by Wagner's music, vision, or ideology, or by the transmission of those elements through other artistic forms. In his 2001 essay, The Aesthetic of Affect, Thinking Art Beyond Representation, art historian Simon O'Sullivan poses the question, how could it happen that in thinking about art, in reading the art object, we missed what art does best? I propose this question be extended to Wagnerism. And in my research, I basically want to answer the question of how is it that in examining Wagnerian art and interpreting its forms that show little stylistic similarities, we have overlooked what it seeks to do and viewed that as its common ground. While much scholarship continues to focus on Wagnerism as an outgrowth of a composer cult, this paper offers a preliminary sketch of an alternative view, one that embraces the movement's diversity as its strength rather than its weakness. By reframing this apparent chaos as an ideological cohesion, unified not by visual style but by emotional resonance, I propose the term Wagnerian affect as the movement's unifying principle, a feeling of intimate recognition catalyzed by Wagner's work and its staging and carried into the lives and practices of those who encountered it. It is this affect, this inner resonance, that my research identifies as the core of Wagnerism and its enduring common denominator. My PhD project looks at Wagnerian art quite similar as it does to Wagner's works themselves, namely as vast and diverse art that seeks to evoke emotion. To analyze what this Wagnerian affect is, we should look at what the term means in art theory. In recent art theory, especially in the work of Simon O'Sullivan, Gilles Deleuze, and Jean-François Lyotard, affect is described as a physical or bodily response that happens on the level of matter. It is something visceral, intense, and non-verbal, something that happens before we can fully make sense of it. You could say it's the impact a foreign body, like a work of art, has on our own bodies. Affect isn't tied to knowledge or meaning, it's asignifying. It happens on a different level altogether, one that doesn't communicate in science or language. It's more about the it happens rather than the what happens. We might be able to reflect on it later to understand or describe it in some way, but that's always just a representation of the original experience. It's never quite the same as the first raw moment, as that ur-affect, so to say. Affect can be fully defined or grasped. It's frozen in time and space and can only really be felt. What stays with us afterwards is its echo, its trace. To really tune into the affect, we almost need to quiet the mind, to let go of the need to interpret or assign meaning, and instead open ourselves up to becoming, a kind of pure experience of the world without the filter of our own subjectivity. And that's where catharsis comes in. This paper suggests that catharsis is a transformation that precedes affect. It's a reconnection to a larger truth or whole that we're part of. It's important to note that affect isn't the same as emotion, though they're often confused. Affect is that first flash of intensity, something pre-conscious and hard to name. Emotion, on the other hand, is more developed. It's when we can say, this makes me feel angry or this makes me feel happy. Affect theory has its roots in early modern thought, especially with thinkers like Wilhelm Wagner and Alois Riegel in the late 19th century, but it's become especially relevant in contemporary art, where many artists aim to create immersive sensory experiences that speak directly to our bodies and provoke strong instinctive reactions. Using this recent art theory, I have formulated a definition of Wagnerian affect to explain the lingering feeling after the cathartic experience Wagner's work imposes on its audience. The Wagnerian affect is the internalized personal echo of a sudden transformative encounter, an experience on the level of the soul, that recognizes the complete and true self, both individually and collectively, outside the material will, through the total work of art. This paper thus argues that at the heart of Wagnerism is not Richard Wagner himself, nor his works per se, but rather the affect that his works evoke. In using this lens, my project aims to detach Wagnerism from its often used label as a composer cult and present it as an aesthetic movement in its own right. The affect Wagner described in his theories, a feeling he never defined but always aimed for, was exercised and implemented in a very practical and methodic manner. His vision and artistic goal is summarized quite well in his speech for the laying of the foundational stone for the Festspielhaus on May 22nd in 1872. There, Wagner describes how, in his theater, nothing should obstruct the spectator's view. There should only be a sense of distance, evoking the feeling of a dream vision, while the music rises like mist from the primordial womb of Gaia, carrying the listener into a state of inspired clairvoyance. In this way, Wagner states, what the audience sees becomes a true reflection of life itself. At the subconscious level of the Wagnerian space, time slows and stretches into an expanded field where the individual encounters only a mirrored image of their own emotions enacted on stage. Materiality dissolves into immateriality, and the subconscious space becomes a shared collective experience. The profound process of emotional and psychological catharsis is thus felt and mirrored both internally and externally. This powerful effect, with its close link to the core structures of religious experience, evokes a religious-like treatment of the art itself. The Bayreuther Festspielhaus, in its very concept, functioned almost like a modern cathedral, a sacred site where people gathered to experience an aestheticized truth. Wagner's forging of this desired effect came across through his rendition of the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art, as it sought to unite different forms of artistic expression, music, drama, poetry, and visual art, into a single immersive experience. Through the elevation of the different art forms to their utmost pure form, they could enhance each other in a fusion that would underline their individual qualities and produce an overpowering effect. My analysis of the Wagnerian affect is organized according to Wagner's creative production process. He started work on his operas with the myths and symbols of Norse, Germanic, Hindustani, and Christian traditions, tapping into archetypal and universal themes like love, power, betrayal, and death. The stories are dense with symbolism, evoking emotional responses on both the conscious and subconscious level. Wagner combined this symbolical narrative with musical innovations, evolving the concept of leitmotifs, or recurring musical themes associated with characters, ideas, or emotions. These motifs allow the audience to develop a subconscious emotional connection to the narrative. Wagner's use of harmony entailed unresolved dissonances and extended harmonic progressions to create tension and emotional yearning. Wagner used the orchestra not merely as accompaniment, but as a central emotional force. The orchestra often amplified the psychological states of the characters, creating an immersive affective experience. Moreover, Wagner's operas created affect through their dramatic structure. Their extended narrative arcs, especially present in the Ring des Nibelungen tetralogy, built emotional intensity over long periods of time for a more profound affectual payoff through emotional investment by the audience. This is added onto by Wagner's manipulation of time within his operas. stretching moments of tension or prolonging climactic events to create a sense of emotional suspension, which is amplified by the unresolved dissonances of Wagner's music. This elevates time to an elastic phenomenon, going quickly at one point and sliding further very slowly at another. To experience the visual and theatrical immersion with which Wagner created spatial effects to enhance the effect of his operas, he designed his Festspielhaus in Bayreuth specifically for his own work, with the goal of intensifying the audience's sensory experience. The interior structure of the completely wooden theatre, which was meant to only be provisionary, allowed the audience to be enveloped in the sound. The concealed orchestra pit at the front of the opera house created a sense of direct contact between the audience and the stage by removing the visual cues of an orchestra. The seating plan was inspired by a Greek amphitheater, giving every member of the audience frontal view of the stage. Of great importance to the creation of the Wagnerian effect is Haus Wahnfried in Bayreuth, the residence Richard Wagner built in 1872, close to the site where the Festspielhaus was built a few years later. Wahnfried was constructed not only to function as a house for the artist and his family, but also as a representation for a brand. Wagner would often receive the avant-garde of intellectual Europe in his house and hold concerts and philosophical debates there. Wagner was very active in designing the house and planned to have a burial ground on site for his own grave from the very beginning, meaning that he meant for the house to eventually become a site of pilgrimage for admirers who would come to visit him after his death. An example of the success of this sanctification are the ivy leaves Austrian composer Anton Bruckner collected from the plants growing over Wagner's grave. With this, Wagner's own life became a means to create affect, to exude what was possible for artists to do and become. Wagner's personal legacy would become an important source for inspiration for artists later on. Wagner created catharsis through affect by the evolution and merging of the art forms. When bringing together all aforementioned aspects of theory and their practical implementation, he becomes what can be called a Gefühlstechniker, or an engineer of feelings. In his total work of art, he infiltrates life through different levels of interior activity, as shown in this visual. The collective, which is the experience had by the audience together, the physical or visceral, which is individual, the psychological, which digs deeper into the individual, and the emotional, which is the level at which the transformative catharsis takes place. I've made a visual here at the bottom of this slide, which shows the process from self-alienation to catharsis. Through a cleansing and self-annihilating pilgrimage to Bayreuth, through the experience of the musical festival collectively, the affect is experienced and catharsis achieved. Since catharsis is a strictly individual gift of knowledge, it is only the affect which can be represented. It is the evocation of the affect which is the core of Wagnerism. It is the aim to carry further this feeling of emotional cleansing that is the foundation of all Wagnerian art. We see the lasting impact of the cathartic experience of Wagner's operas in these exemplary contemporary witness testimonies of Wagnerians. American poet and music lover Lucy Lowell often wrote about Wagner in her diary, describing the effect of his operas as bewitching, heavenly, and tremendous, as she could not fix her mind on anything else for days afterwards. About 25 years earlier, the famous poet Charles Baudelaire had written a letter to Wagner, thanking him for remembering him of who he was. At the end of the 19th century, fin de siècle icon Oscar Wilde echoed this spirit when he wrote that Wagner's music reminded him of himself and that it brought the soul into harmony with all the right things. By placing affect at the center of Wagnerism, I have constructed a definition of the movement through which I study it. This definition is kept deliberately broad in recognition of the extraordinary diversity of Wagnerian expression, and it takes into account works of architecture, visual art, music, and literature alike. In my PhD research, Wagnerism is thus defined as any work of art or aesthetic theory that seeks to exude a personalized interpretation, recreation, visualization, abstraction, or allegorization of the effect evoked by the aesthetic theories and muziekdramen of Richard Wagner. By adhering to this definition, Wagnerism moves beyond being seen merely as a composer cult. It emerges instead as an aesthetic movement inspired by the emotional and transformational power of Wagner's work, whether directly through his compositions and writings, or through the broader boundaries he broke as an artist. With his framework in mind, we will now turn to some examples of effectual Wagnerism as expressed in fields of art and architecture. The Belgian painter Jean Delville offers a compelling example of Wagner's influence, particularly in the realm of the occult and the emphasis on spirituality and transcendence in art. Deeply inspired by Wagner, Delville adopted a holistic approach to his work, seeking to create art that conveyed profound spiritual messages. He fused elements from literature, music, and esoteric traditions into his art, using his work as a vehicle to express higher truth and ideals. Delville's work is part of the broader symbolist tradition, which aimed to create immersive experiences intended to evoke a spiritual effect. A key method Delville employed was the symbolist concept of correspondence, the ideal that every element in the material world corresponds to an element in a higher surreal dimension. By weaving these symbols into his paintings, Delville aimed to help his audience see further, to glimpse beyond mere reality into the transcendent dimensions that exist within every human being. In doing so, he positioned himself not merely as an artist, but as a mediator between the divine and the material, a spiritual guide leading his viewers closer to a part of themselves that would otherwise remain hidden. Delville's early involvement with the Wagner admiring Rose et Croix Salon in Paris further highlights this connection. Within these circles, Delville adhered to the same idealized view of Wagner, seeing him not simply as a composer, but as a visionary who had opened new pathways toward the spiritual through art. The image on the slide suggests Delville's fusion of mysticism, symbolism, and affect, a visual expression of Wagnerian transcendence through an entirely personal and deeply spiritual lens. Following the spiritual and symbolic approach of Jean Delville, we now turn to a very different but equally important expression of the Wagnerian affect, the work of the Swiss stage designer and theorist Adolphe Appia. Adolphe Appia is considered one of the most pivotal figures in the development of modern stage design. Drawing inspiration from Wagner's theatrical innovations at Bayreuth, Appia sought to create immersive, unified theatrical experiences that fused all elements of production: music, movement, space, light, and line. Rejecting the artificiality of overly historicized or pseudo-realistic traditional stage designs, Appia aimed to focus the audience's attention on the core content of the performance, experienced through the body's movement in space. While 19th century sets were largely two-dimensional and painterly, Appia's stage designs were three-dimensional, architecture, sober in color, and fully interactive, allowing performers to physically engage with the set as part of the performance itself. Beyond his innovations in spatial design, Appia introduced a revolutionary use of light as an expressive tool. Stage lighting was no longer merely functional, it became central to defining space, responding dynamically to the music and the movement on stage, and reinforcing the emotional flow of the performance. In this way, Appia sought to unify the visual, musical, and emotional dimensions of the theatrical experiences, creating a true Gesamtkunstwerk. Appia also envisioned dissolving the traditional proscenium arch, a barrier between the stage and the audience, in order to foster a direct fusion between embodied theatrical space and the embodied experience of the spectators themselves. Although Appia's design bear no visual resemblance to the mystical paintings of Jean Delville, they nonetheless aim to evoke an affectual response by highlighting different facets of the Wagnerian affect, an effect that was first fully materialized by Richard Wagner himself. Building further on how artists transformed the Wagnerian affect in their own ways, we now turn to the remarkable and lesser-known example, the Nibelungenhalle. Made by the architects Hans Meyer, Werner Behrendt, and filled with paintings by the artist Hermann Hendrich that depict scenes from Wagner's operas, the monument was built in 1913 to commemorate Richard Wagner's 100th birthday. Remarkably, very little has been written on this modern temple, which has been lost to the public attention after the Second World War. The Nibelungenhalle, which aims to bring together all art forms, is an attempt to capture the transformative, sanctified feeling of Wagner's operas. The round shapes of the Jugendstil building are adorned both on the outside and the inside with fin de siècle renditions of the Nordic style. Snake and rune motifs are interchangeably used with Hindustanic imagery and Art Nouveau. Through its construction, inspired by both a Germanic hall, an ancient temple, and a round Orthodox building, the building was meant to encapsulate the visitor, to immerse him into the mythic, all-encompassing world of Richard Wagner, and to evoke the meditative state of the Wagnerian affect. The site around the building, which sits on top of the Drachenfels or Dragon Rock Mountains outside of the small town of Königswinter near Cologne, was structured as a luscious garden so that visitors, after their long journey up the mountain, would feel as if they were in a different world once entering the site. In 1933, a large stone dragon luring out of a concrete grotto was added to the site, as the building gathered more attention with the rise of the National Socialist Party. The roundness of the building, made out of rough rocks and concrete, looks out over all points of the compass. From the outside, 12 window-like openings in the roof can be seen, which are decorated with the 12 zodiac signs from the inside. Both elements are meant to embody a feeling of totality and encompassing of a whole universe. On the inside, this totality becomes even more clear. The temple-like structure of the building starts in the foyer, where a large tapestry hangs with the depiction of the three Norns, weavers of the fate of men. This tapestry was meant to seal off the holiness that could be found within and to separate the last remnants of the real world before entering to the main round hall. The paintings in this hall, made by Hermann Hendrich, depict scenes from Wagner's famous tetralogy, De Ring des Nibelungen. The apsis, which is in the most church-like element of the building and lays at the back, holds paintings that refer to scenes from the biblically inspired opera Parsifal. The ceiling of the building is painted blue to represent the night sky, and the floor is decorated with imagery representing the four elements. Central on this floor is the image of the Midgard serpent, another element picked from Norse mythology. Along the curves of the exhibition walls are several benches for viewers to sit and meditate on. This entire temple-like building, which was often used to host musical performances, is thus meant to evoke a divinity free from religion, a hypnotic meditation not through God but through art. The location of the site, the merging of the art forms, and the religious elements do not aim to replicate Richard Wagner, but to replicate the desired effect on the viewer, who partakes in the worship of art and is overcome and transformed by its power. The Nibelungenhalle represents an expression of artistic transformation of the Wagnerian affect, and with that, an expression of Wagnerism. This final example of the artistic transformation of the Wagnerian affect shows a case where there are no direct ties to Wagner himself. The artist colony on the Mathildenhöhe in Darmstadt, Germany, was founded in 1899 by the Art Nouveau artist and architect group Die Sieben. Peter Behrens, Paul Burg, Rudolf Bossold, Hans Christiansen, Ludwig Habig, Patrice Huber, and the renowned Joseph Maria Olbrich. Their goal was to foster the development of a new German modern art and new ways of living. Together, they built a colony and curated exhibitions that fused music, performance, ritual, architecture, literature, and visual art into a single unified experience. The site was conceived as a total artistic environment where architectural forms were integrated with symbolic ornamentation and where mythological and abstract imagery aimed to engage the individual imagination, drawing inspiration from the emotional strategies and liturgical symbolism found in Christian sacred spaces. The entire colony functioned through a carefully planned spatial choreography, a strict premeditated arrangement of buildings and pathways designed to direct the visitor's movement and experience. Changes in scale, lighting, and ornamentation were used deliberately to elicit emotional responses and provoke affect. The opening of the first exhibition in 1901, depicted on the photograph on the right side of the slide, was heavily influenced by the poetry of Friedrich Nietzsche. Dressed in a white robe, Peter Behrens read aloud a poem entitled Das Zeichen, inspired by Thus Spoke Zarathustra, while framed by a choir of 50 voices. At the climax of the reading, Behrens revealed a crystal symbolizing the revelation of sacred truth through art. At the heart of the colony, a grand theatre was also planned, a space that would no longer serve to entertain the bourgeoisie, as was typical of early 19th century theatre, but would function as a devotional temple for catharsis. The stage was designed to be flat, surrounded by the audience, and accessed by an ascending terrace, intentionally removing the barrier between audience and performance. Although this theatre was never completed, and it no longer exists today, its concept reveals an underlying aspiration, a transformation of the arts into a collective, emotional, almost sacred experience. Although none of the members of Die Sieben explicitly reference Wagner, their work stands firmly in the tradition of Wagnerian principles. They carried forward many aspects of Wagner's utopian vision, the unification of the arts, the emotional enlightenment of the individual, and the use of art as a guide into the future. Thus, we can conclude that while Wagnerism lacks a single distinct visual style, Wagnerian art can nevertheless be recognized by a shared ideological core, the affect or emotional impact it generates. Through the experience of catharsis, either directly inspired by Wagner's works and theories or by his broader legacy of breaking artistic boundaries, Wagnerians personalized the affect and carried it further. They created a movement without a unified face, but with a single beating heart. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to any questions or discussions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much and congratulations, Dagmar.
Thank you.
So, I don't know, it's too much to...
Yeah.
Maybe, yes. Andrea, I know that you...
Maybe
you have
a question.
Yeah, okay, yes. Okay.
Maybe a question a bit complex, but I try.
Go.
For you, how much of Wagner remains in Wagnerism? Has Wagner been misrepresented or instrumentalized, or no?
The fact that Wagner has been misinterpreted within Wagnerism, this is a very this is a historical fact. So
Yes.
a lot of Wagnerians in the 19th century and early 20th century had never heard Wagner, had not met him, had not read anything of his writings, were just following a trend. So he has been misinterpreted, definitely. How much of Wagner remains? I think within Wagnerism quite a lot. There's a lot of idolized Wagnerism out there, a lot of homage paintings, poetry, music made especially for Wagner. I think of Bruckner's symphony, for example. This is very much Wagner within Wagnerism. But I think so I take note of this in my PhD as well. This is one of the Wagnerian effects. It's idolizing effect. It's a mimetic effect as well. So you are sort of mirroring Wagnerism. You're mirroring Wagner in your own art. So you are taking from Wagner directly. But I wanted to underline, because this has not been done in Wagner scholarship yet, I wanted to underline Wagnerism away from Wagner. So I wanted to emphasize the fact that Wagner's impact was so grand, so enormous, that it had an impact on works of art that had nothing to do with Wagner directly. And I think this is something that people often fail to realize, is how impactful Wagner has really been, even more so than we already think. So that's also a bit of the goal, and also really to put Wagnerism in the main stream of scholarly consciousness, to say it's not it's more than a cult, it's more than just idolizing a person, even though that's part of it. It's an artistic inspiration. It's I guess the stamp of the late 19th century in Europe, in a way. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Dagmar. Maybe I have another question too.
Yes.
Because we decided to award you the first prize, even because your research seems to, how can I say, seems to open many paths. Okay, many new paths. Okay. So my question is, in which direction do you think your study on or Wagnerism might develop?
Right. So thankfully, I have a quite clear-cut direction, thanks to my PhD and the requirements of the university. So if I could share my my screen again, I have a.
Yes. Okay.
I hope
okay,
this is visible. Is this visible? My slide?
Yes. PhD aims. Yes, I can see it. Yeah. Okay.
So I in my PhD, I focus on Wagnerism outside of Paris. So that's my main, this is how it will develop. First, I laid this sort of foundational element, I guess, in my first year on the Wagnerian effect, which is my main foundational lens. This is how I will see Wagnerism. And then geographically, it will be outside of Paris, because this is scholarship on Wagnerism has been very geographically lopsided on Paris, because it's, I mean, a lot happened in Paris during the period, but just as much happened in Brussels, London, and Vienna together. And I want to look at these, I guess, forgotten nexuses of artistic production. And then, of course, install a paradigm of iconological coherence, which is what I'm doing with the effect. And then I'll look at Wagnerian art. So I'll look at the influence of Wagner's effect on aesthetic, personal, and social expressions of Wagnerism. And I will focus on Wagnerian spaces of expression particularly. So this means ideological spaces, which means spaces in your own head. This means networks, so a space of networking. This means actual spaces of performance. Where were these Wagnerian works performed? Where were they spread? It was often in artists' ateliers that these things happened. So especially in the semi-private space, that's my main focus of interest. So in researching these spaces, really highlighting these networks that existed, networks of practices, networks of interaction, networks of identity. Wagnerism was
with networks. Sorry, what do you mean with networks?
So just people communicating with each other, people that knew each other. So artist networks.
Okay.
Yeah,
like the Wagner Society, like the Wagner Society.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
So early
Okay.
Wagner societies, but also people who maybe artists who were living on the border of these societies, who were not really part of it, but still really wanted to spread Wagner's ideas. So in the broadest sense. And then I'll focus on Wagnerism as a hub for the development of new identities. So a nationalist identity, gender identity. So women, especially feminists, really took to Wagner, which is something that is forgotten now. We don't remember this at all, but Wagner is really the coolest thing out there at some point. And I'll focus on women in these networks particularly because they did help spread Wagnerism in a big way that has not been really identified yet outside of France, at least.
Okay.
And there is some scholarship in North America on North American Wagnerians, but that does not. I won't include that in my.
Okay.
So I hope that
we discovered about talking about women, Wagnerian women. We discovered, thanks to our digital Wagner library, Wagnerian library, that
yes,
a Roman Wagner society founded in the 1930 something was founded by a woman, and then suddenly disappeared. We have the information on our archive. Okay, no, it's just to sharing to you this information.
That's very interesting. Yeah,
that's very, I have no idea who. I have the name. We have the name of this lady, but this Wagner society, this Roman Wagner society, suddenly disappeared. So it's quite difficult to find information about it. But anyway, I don't know if Andrea, you have other question. I don't know. It's fine. Okay. So if we don't have other question from on Facebook, I would like to thank you again, Dagmar, and
congratulations.
Congratulations, really, because it's a beautiful topic. You made a great job. You are doing a great job, and we are proud because now, since you are the winner of the first edition of the Ludwig Prize 2024, you are now part of the La Voce Wagneriana, the Richard Wagner Society of Avellino.
Yes, absolutely.
So we are proud. Yes, we're very proud. Congratulations again. So we invite our follower, to continue to follow us through our social media, and I would like even to remind that our society, the Richard Wagner Society of Avellino, is a society mainly dedicated to Wagnerian research. So we warmly encourage all scholars of Richard Wagner to join us and became member, to join us as a member. So thank you again, Dagmar. Thank you even to our artistic director, Andrea Camparsi. It's a strange coincidence because I'm an art historian and Andrea wrote a book about Wagnerism. Okay, so you, Dagmar, you are an art historian.
Yes.
It's a great combination. But anyway, thank you again, Dagmar. Thank you so much and congratulations. Okay, so see you.
Congratulations.
Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next conference. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye-bye.